Hello, everyone. This is Moin Mir going live on the Karwaan heritage page. If you can hear me, do let me know. And so then we know that you guys are online. Hello, Ishan. Good to see you. We will just wait for a few adjustments if that's all right, and then we will start. Just bear with me a second. Great. So I got a message from Ishan saying that you can hear me and you can see me, which is the most important thing. Great. Sorry about the phone just dropping away a little bit. I apologize for that, but I'm just about to adjust and get this in a correct space, and we shall be away. I firstly want to say thank you very much to the Karwaan Heritage page and all of the people who are behind that. It's a wonderful initiative, and it's great to have you, carrying out this work on history and the legacy of our fabulous history. I'm based in London, but I'm always keeping in touch with India and all the fantastic work that is happening, by the likes of you folks in keeping our heritage alive. So congratulations, well done, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to engage with the young folks in India as well as globally now that we are on social media. So we'll get started. The conversation today, or the lecture today, is going to be about my book, which is, just bear with me a second, which is Surat, Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. This is a book that was published by Rowley Books in India and by Amberley Books in Britain in 2017. And it's done exceptionally well. Dr. Shashi Tharoor was very kind to have launched the book and even endorsed the book because it was a story of the English East India Company taking over Surat, and then the fight that the Prince of Surat led against the English East India Company. So we'll very quickly get started about the story, because I think that's what's most important, and that's what should be actually spoken about. So let's understand Surat first. Surat was, undoubtedly Mughal India's greatest port. It was through the 1500s, through the 1600s, and even through the 1700s. So a good portion of about 250 odd years. Thank you, Jaya, for that compliment, but we'll carry on with the story. So for about 250 years, Surat was really the epitome or the pinnacle of maritime trade of Hindustan. It was nurtured by the Gujarat sultans before the Mughals, and when the Mughals took it under Akbar in the mid 1500s, they nurtured Surat even further. Now, by the time it was the 1600s and the 1700s, Surat had really peaked. It was an eclectic city. You had people from Iraq, you had people from Turkey, you had Portuguese, you had the Italians, you had even the Dutch. The local Surti mix was fantastic. You had the Bori Muslims who were traders. You had the Armenian Jews. You had, of course, the Jains, the Hindus, all of them living harmoniously together and bringing about this fantastic, bringing together this incredible city. Someone has just said, could I briefly talk about Surat history before the Mughals? I'll do that briefly because that's not the contents of the book. But yes, Surat, even before the Mughals took it, I suspect it was the exact date is 1573 when Akbar took it. It was a thriving port, a port which had an immense amount of significance. The sultans of Gujarat had nurtured it, and the governors that the sultans of Gujarat had placed the governors that the sultans of Gujarat had placed, really worked hard to make it into the most iconic port. One of the governors of Surat, called Khudawand Khan, whose mausoleum in Surat is really worth a visit. And I urge you, if you haven't been to Surat, visit besides the cemeteries of the English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and even the French. Visit the mausoleum of Khudawand Khan, who was the governor of Surat under the sultans of Surat. This is pre-Mughal, for people who are interested in pre-Mughal. And it's an extraordinary mausoleum with the most intricate stone carving. And unfortunately, it's falling to pieces. So visit it before we lose that mausoleum. Khudawand Khan was an incredibly brave man, and he was instrumental in fighting the Portuguese. It's also said that the Portuguese feared him. During a raid that the Portuguese did on Surat, Khudawand Khan, was killed because a cannonball landed very close to where he was actually marshalling his troops, resisting the Portuguese invasion. And Khudawand Khan was basically perished, and he lies buried there in Surat. So do visit it. But now coming back to the main core of this book. So by the time it is the 1600s, the English East India Company make a foray into the Arabian Sea, and they, oddly enough, happen to defeat a Portuguese fleet just off Surat. By the early 1600s, the Portuguese influence in the Arabian Sea is waning, and because of this defeat, it spells their death knell. But it also spells the beginning of the East India Company in India. Not very many people know. A lot of people, just about last week when I was having a conversation with Willie Dalrymple, there were people who thought that the English first landed in Bengal, but that's incorrect. The English first landed in Surat. And when they landed in Surat, Sir Thomas Roe was so taken in by the city, he declared Surat to be the fountain of all East India trade. These were his words. And he said, the English must remain steadfast against the Dutch and against the growing influence of the French in order to keep on the good side of the emperors sitting in Delhi. So Thomas Roe goes to Delhi. He meets Emperor Jahangir. I think this is a very well-known fact. And Jahangir gives him the license to trade. So Thomas Roe comes back to Surat, goes back to England, and goes and talks about this incredible empire, the Mughal Empire, and this fantastic city called Surat to James I, who says, "Listen, please go ahead and trade now that you've got the acceptance of the Mughal Emperor." Trading by the English East India Company initially is concentrated, as we all know, on spices, on cotton, and predominantly also on bullion, which is gold, to satisfy the needs in the Malacca. As time passes, the East India Company grows in power on that slight little western strip of India. And they're waiting and they're watching, because it also happens that they get in dowry a string of islands 150 miles south of Surat, which happens to be Bombay. As time would play out, it would become Bombay that would become the nemesis of Surat. Because once the English East India Company had acquired Bombay through a dowry that Catherine of Braganza gave to her husband, Charles of Britain, and Charles was not really, and the King of Britain was not really interested in these measly pickings, these little islands. He passes them off to the East India Company that make it their headquarters. Now begins the tug of war between the Nawabs of Surat and the East India Company in Bombay. So by the time it is 1707, Aurangzeb, the last imperial or the last really powerful Mughal emperor, has died, and the Nawabs of Surat declare independence. So the first Nawab of Surat to really declare independence is Tughlaqabad Khan. Now, Tughlaqabad Khan was a soldier of fortune who had seen the Mughal Empire beginning to collapse. He found his way south into Surat and declared himself Nawab of Surat. His first and most important act is to keep the English East India Company in check, because he realizes that they're growing in power. And what is their power? Their power is the navy. Remember, the Mughals were very powerful, on land. Even the Indian princes were very powerful on land, but they didn't have a navy. And Surat was a port, and docking at Surat's port was the most incredible firepower of the English East India Company. Also, unknowingly, the English kept bringing in warships into Bombay, which they actually had. So Tughlaqabad Khan was always concerned about the ambitions of the East India Company. By the time it is 1799, and I'm taking you very quickly to that point. One man has entered India, and his name is Richard Wellesley. Now, Richard Wellesley comes to India with the sole objective of conquering. His objective is not to trade. And he immediately goes to war with the Marathas. He fights the Battle of Assaye, defeats them. He goes in and picks up arms against Tipu Sultan. He goes and defeats Tipu Sultan in 1799. And as soon as he does that, and he's victorious, he turns his attention to Surat. Surat is still a very vibrant port, but the Nawab is an aging Nawab. His name is Nawab Mir Nasiruddin Khan. He's aging. He doesn't have the firepower of the East India Company's military might. Because from 1608 till 1799, they've obviously grown in an extraordinary military might. And that's not the story of the book. The story of the book is Surat, fall of a port, rise of a prince. So I'll stay to that. Anyways, so the minute Richard Wellesley, who's the father of the Duke of Wellington, wins his war against Tipu, he turns his attention to Surat. And Nawab Nasiruddin, as I mentioned, who's an aging Nawab, is surrounded by Wellesley's men who force him to sign a treaty. That treaty is an explicit treaty, and it says that the Nawabs of Surat will be allowed to keep their personal estates, which basically comprise 1/3 of Surat. There are 6 palaces there. There are orchards, there are gardens. The estates provide an enormous amount of employment to textile weavers, to potters, to stable boys. So 1/3 of Surat is still the private property of the Nawab. So the deal is, or the treaty is, that the Nawab will be allowed to keep his private estates. He will be given a pension of 150,000 rupees, which is 15,000 pounds, and it specifically says that the treaty will go on for perpetuity, and that the descendants of the Nawab will be guaranteed this from generation to generation. Keeping this in mind, the very aging old Nawab looks at the forces of Richard Wellesley. I mean, Richard Wellesley's forces are, close to 700,000. And the Nawab has 4,000 men. So, and Richard Wellesley is absolutely adamant, and he threatens forceful invasion of Surat. Now, by the time he threatens that, Nawab Nasiruddin is obviously, quite concerned, because Surat will go up in flames if he opposes Wellesley. Nawab Nasiruddin Mir Nasiruddin signs the treaty, and the Surat port falls to the English East India Company. Nawab Nasiruddin, really loves Surat. It is with great love and passion that he nurtures the craftsmen of Surat, the textile weavers of Surat, the potters of Surat. He takes great pride in the castle of Surat, in looking after the heritage of Surat. He's a poet. He loves the orchards. In fact, he also wants to convert some of those enormous gardens that are part of his private property into parks for the people of Surat. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, Nawab Nasiruddin is an aging man. And in 1842, he dies. Sorry, my apologies. He dies in 1821. He's succeeded by his son, Nawab Mir Afzaluddin. Now, Nawab Mir Afzaluddin Khan is a very generous man, once again a poet of sorts, but he is given to a life of pleasure. He knows he doesn't have the administrative responsibilities that his father had of administering Surat, and all he has to do is live the life of leisure and pleasure, which Nawab Mir Afzaluddin Khan does. He's assured a pension, he's assured his estates, and he's also assured the fact that the people that the estates employ, as I mentioned, the weavers, the karigars, the textile makers, will keep their jobs. So he lives the life of leisure and pleasure, looking after his estates. But he's a worried man. And the reason why he's a worried man is because he has just one surviving daughter. And something within him tells him that after his death, the English East India Company can come up to its tricks. And his only daughter is Bakhtiyar-un-Nisa Begum. And he starts really worrying about what's going to happen to the succession to the estates on his death. So the first thing he does, and it's very important for the very wonderful viewers who've tuned in, is to see the hypocrisy of the East India Company. The first thing he does is he reaches out to the English East India Company and he says, listen, I need you to guarantee that you will not interfere in the succession that will happen after me. So Elphinstone, who's the governor of Bombay, writes back to Afzaluddin saying, of course, Your Highness, we will never interfere in the succession. You are the sole, you're the sole in charge of your estates, and whatever you will say, we will abide by. So he gets that written guarantee that the East India Company will not interfere in the succession after him. But he's still a worried man. And so Nawab Mir Afzaluddin starts looking out for a male successor, because he's not really convinced within his heart that the East India Company will abide by what they are saying. So he looks for a successor. The two princes of Delhi, Mirza Bakht and Humayun Bakht, are summoned as possible husbands to his daughter. They come into Surat and they fall into the opium dens. So upset is Nawab Afzaluddin seeing these Mughal princes in opium dens that he sends them back to Delhi. But the search for a male successor continues. And so Nawab Mir Afzaluddin Khan turns his attention to Saurashtra. Saurashtra is that part of Gujarat, and it's very important to understand this, that is teeming with princely states. Sau means 100, Rashtra means states. So there are 100 princes in Saurashtra. Small states, all of them jostling for importance. And so he looks at these for a successor in these states. One of these states, princely states, is a state called Kamadhya. It's a small state of about 4 or 5 villages. The ruler of that state is who he picks for his succession. The name of that prince is Meer Jafar Ali Khan. So Afzaluddin officially adopts the ruling prince of Kamadhya, who is Meer Jafar Ali Khan, as his son. And not just that, he gets him married to his only daughter. And there's a strategy in this. So He thinks that if the English East India Company refuses the succession of his daughter, Bakhtiar-un-Nisa Begum, based on gender, saying that she's a lady, they will have to accept the succession of his adopted son, Meer Jafar Ali Khan, as the successor. So it's a very clear strategy that Mir Afzaluddin is playing. If you don't accept my daughter, you have to accept my adopted son. If you don't accept my adopted son, you have to accept my daughter. And he also has the letter from the governor, Elphinstone, saying that we will not interfere in succession. Having adopted Meer Jafar Ali Khan, who is the ruler of Kamadhya, as his son, and having got him married to his daughter, Mir Afzaluddin Khan is a very happy man, and he resigns himself to looking after Surat. His adopted son, the ruler of Kamadhya, and also the successor, Mir Jafar Ali Khan, helps him in managing his estates. One of the gardens is supposed to be converted into a private park for the people of Surat to enjoy the park of Surat. And all of these incredible visions that the Nawab family has for Surat is being played out. I must add here, which I forgot to add, is that the East India Company was so hell-bent on destroying Surat that they even stopped the mint. Now, you must understand that Surat was the place where the coins for the Mughals were minted and distributed in many parts of India. But to stop trade in Surat and to build trade in Bombay, the East India Company forcibly stop the mint through sheer force. And as a result, trading in Surat drops. And with that, they lure the merchants away from Surat to Bombay, giving them the flaky excuse that, listen, now you can't trade in Surat, and by this time, you need to move to Bombay, forget about Surat. So there is this constant battle going on, this tug of war between the Nawabs to keep the merchants in Surat and the East India Company trying to lure the merchants to Bombay. One of the things that they did treacherously is to shut down the mint. Anyways, coming back to Mir Afzaluddin Khan and Mir Jafar Ali Khan, his adopted son, while they are making incredible progress in lifting Surat's importance again, unfortunately, Mir Afzaluddin Khan dies in 1842. Now, with the death of Mir Afzaluddin Khan, the East India Company step in and start playing their tricks. The first thing they do is tear up the letter that Elphinstone had assured Nawab Mir Afzaluddin Khan of succession. So the first thing they say is, the daughter is not accepted, neither is the adopted son. They send in the troops, and every estate, every garden, every palace is sealed off. The pension of £15,000 that was promised from generation to generation, from perpetuity, is stopped. And what does that do? It leaves the young family of Mir Jafar Ali Khan and Bakhtiar-un-Nisa Begum literally hand to mouth in the servants' quarters of the palace. And this is how badly the English East India Company treated the Nawab family of Surat. They went back on their words, they tore up the treaty, they tore up all their assurances, and it really becomes a tragic affair. Now, the Prince of Surat, Mir Jafar Ali Khan, who's also the Prince of Kamadhya, looks at his wife, Bakhtiar-un-Nisa Begum, and he realizes that she's ailing. She's ailing with tuberculosis, and she's on her deathbed. She had produced 2 daughters for them, and here she's dying. Now, surrounded with all of this, doom and gloom, Mir Jafar Ali Khan is left with no option, and he writes to the East India Company and saying that this is injustice of the highest order. You have broken the treaty, you have violated your terms, you have stopped the family's income, you have confined us to servants' quarters. My wife is dying, I have 2 infant daughters. What are you planning to do? And the East India Company writes back saying, we disregard all your comments, and we're taking charge of the estates, and we're going to publicly auction off the estates, regardless of what you have to say. So you can imagine the plight of Mir Jafar Ali Khan, who is the successor to Mir Afzaluddin Khan. He's got a dying wife in his arms. Surat is crumbling. And all the English East India Company can think of is usurping the estates and putting them up for public auction. Now, all of this is playing desperately on Mir Jafar Ali Khan's mind. He's a 26-year-old young man with a dying wife and 2 infant daughters. In all of this doom and gloom, he does something quite extraordinary. He decides not to fight the East India Company in India, but to challenge them in Britain. And here is a man, you can see his vision. He's a visionary because he realizes that he will never get justice in India. And so he takes it upon himself to voyage to England to shatter the reputation of the East India Company in Britain. It's an incredible decision because even the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam had tried by sending emissaries to Britain, but he had failed. And so in 1844, Mir Jafar Ali Khan, accompanied with 2 secretaries, decides to embark on this incredible voyage to London. He looks at his wife. The wife holds on to him and says, "This is a battle for our daughters. Go and fight." And knowing that he probably would never see his wife, who's ailing with tuberculosis, the 26-year-old Prince of Surat leaves Surat, boards the ship Bentinck for Britain. He lands up in Britain in 1844. And the minute he lands in Britain, there is this huge, fanfare surrounding the Indian prince who has landed in Britain, and a large number of, members of parliament, lawyers, distinguished lords, dukes, write about the arrival of the Prince of Surat and Kamadhya, and the Times in England is filled with articles about this very handsome, sharp-featured 26-year-old. But that is not the objective that Mir Jafar Ali Khan came to England with. And he takes up residence in Sloane Square, on Sloane Street, and starts corresponding with leading members of parliament, trying to get them to see his case. Initially, there's, as I mentioned, interest in this young Indian prince. And he's taken to operas, and he's taken to, for walks in Hyde Park, and the English aristocracy starts spending a lot of time with this exotic specimen from India, as they write about him. He's quite the star, if you wish, of English society. But he's very focused on his attention, on his job, which is to get the East India Company to take notice of the malpractices of the officials in Surat. He manages to secure a meeting with the chairman of the East India Company, someone called James Shepherd. Now, this once again gives you an insight into how duality was being played out in the echelons of power in London in the East India Company. At the meeting with the chairman, James Shepherd, the chairman, says, "I sympathize with you. This is absolute injustice. This is a breach of treaty. This cannot happen." And the meeting ends. What Mir Jafar Ali Khan doesn't realize that when he gets into his carriage on the way to his apartment in Sloane Street, buoyed with exuberance, thinking that his case is going to be now, closed, it's going to be a closed and shut case, and he's going to win back his estates, the wise chairman of the English East India Company tells the chairman that this will set a precedence for Indians to come to Britain and challenge the East India Company. We should not let this happen. And so he prevails upon the chairman, saying that the board of directors of the East India Company will thwart anything that the chairman would try and support the Indian prince. So here you can see the East India Company, how it plays out. It's political churnings. And so sitting in his rented apartment, visiting operas on the odd occasion, and seeing the sights and sounds of London, and being written about. And when Mir Jafar Ali Khan enters the Lord Chancery's chambers, it's written that when he enters the Lord Chancery's chambers, the lords stood up on benches to see him in his regal Mughal gowns and turbans. While all of this is going on, the East India Company is up to its treacherous tricks again. And they send him a letter saying that we've considered your case. However, we're not going to entertain this any further, and you're better off going back to India. And, this is absolutely, it is something which is soul destroying for Mir Jafar Ali Khan. Here he is in England. He's got enough traction in terms of attention, but he's not been able to get enough traction politically and strategically. The other aspect also is that he's running out of cash to stay in England. And so it dawns on him that he must return to India empty-handed. And so with a deeply aggrieved, he returns to India. He returns to India, he goes back to Surat, and Surat is in shambles. There is complete decay of the estates. The parks that were to be converted into public parks were dry because of lack of irrigation, thanks to the officials of the East India Company. The heritage buildings were crumbling because the East India Company did not maintain them well. But worst of all, the castle of Surat, which was the pride of Surat and India's symbol of maritime trade, is crumbling because the English East India Company go and make it a customs home for their officials to sit in who do not have the slightest understanding of heritage, of how to manage heritage buildings. And the castle is crumbling. But the worst is when he goes back to his little accommodation and he sees his wife. And his wife is literally just waiting for him to return and counting her moments, her last moments. His infant daughters, who are just 6 and 4, cling on to him and when they see him. And it's a sense of, there's a sense of loneliness in the infant daughters because they know their grandfather has died, their mother is dying, and their father was away in England fighting for them. Anyways, within a month of his return, his wife, Bakhtiyar-un-Nisa Begum, dies of tuberculosis. And that leaves him completely and utterly shattered. He's left all alone looking after the interests of his 2 daughters. By this time, he also realizes that he doesn't have a son, and the English East India Company trains its eyes on his small principality of Kamadhya. Because don't forget, he was also the ruler of his small principality in Saurashtra, Kamadhya, and he doesn't have a son. So the English East India Company now send out a notice saying, you don't have a son, and you are not in Kamadhya enough, so you're not managing that state very well, and so we're coming to take that off you. So you can imagine the plight of this young prince. He's lost Surat, he's lost his dear wife, his 2 children don't have an income, and now the East India Company is making their moves to take over Kamadhya, which is his paternal principality. So he rushes to this incredibly beautiful rural principality of Kamadhya to take charge. Because he can't lose that, because that's the only income of the family. And as he goes there, he flings himself into Sufism. And he flings himself into meditation. And he flings himself into really understanding spirituality and understanding, the ways of God. Because he feels he's completely undone. In Kamadhya, he spends time with his local farmers, the peasants who are so warm and affectionate towards their prince. And he tries to stay away from the malpractices of the Sufi of the East India Company by spending time with the Sufis of Saurashtra. After 9 years of wandering through his rural principality, he is buoyed with greater resilience. And the reason he is buoyed with greater resilience is because the English East India Company pass a legislation in the Bombay courts that their decision on Surat is now final and there can be no challenge to it. But there's something within him that makes him rise up to this challenge. And after 9 years of living the life of a wandering prince in his rural principality, he does something quite astonishing. There are a few villages and an extraordinary amount of land that he has in his paternal principality of Kamadya, and he puts that on mortgage. He puts that on mortgage and he collects cash and he decides to go back to England to fight the East India Company. His young daughters by this time are 14 and 12, and they show incredible resilience. Especially the 14-year-old Ladli Begum Sahiba. She tells her father that you must go and fight, and I will support you if you want to go back to England to fight. However, there is enormous pressure on Mir Jafar Ali Khan to marry again and have a son, because if he leaves Kamadya, the East India Company will take charge of that and he will lose even that. So against his personal wishes, but under pressure from the administrators of Kamadya, he marries a second time. She is the daughter of the Qazi of Ahmedabad, and she is a Sayyid, that is a descendant of a prophet, and he marries her hoping that he would have a son. But the time has come to return to England to fight, and he embarks on his journey again for England in October 1853. He reaches England in 1853, December 1853, again, and it's the height of winter, heavy snowfall in London. He comes wrapped in his shawls, and once again the British press go crazy about him, and they start writing about his second coming into England. But this time he's unaffected by all the adulation that he's getting in the British press. His sole focus is taking the English East India Company to court in Britain. And how does he manage to do that? Because he has a chance meeting with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at the Ascot, which is the lodestar event of the British social calendar. The Ascot is the most prestigious horse racing event in Britain. Mir Jafar Ali Khan is invited there. He meets Queen Victoria. He meets Prince Albert, who are both moved by his story. By this time, Queen Victoria has a real longing for India. She wants to know more about India. She wants to know more about this country that is being ruled by a company. Excuse me. She has an enormous amount of respect for the Indian culture. And here is this Indian prince who's presented himself to her. And what Prince Albert does is something quite astonishing. He introduces Mir Jafar Ali Khan to Sir Richard Bethel, who is the Solicitor General to the Queen. He also introduces him to Sir Fitzroy Kelly and Sir Sir Fitzroy Kelly and Sir Erskine Perry, who are two leading members of Parliament who would take the cause of Mir Jafar Ali Khan into the Houses of Parliament. Now, I'd like you to picture this. This is 1853. The empire is at its peak in India. Here is an Indian in Britain who is challenging the East India Company through the lawyers who are planning to take his case into the Houses of Parliament. This would be the first time an Indian would enter the Houses of Parliament, not to sightsee, but to challenge the East India Company on their home turf. The strategy is first to send the bill called the Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill to, to the Special Judicial Committee and the Privy Council, who would, just give me a second. Sorry about that. So the Judicial Committee and the Privy Council would study the bill and then admit it in Parliament if they thought it was worth its while. All of this takes six months. In that period of 6 months, Mir Jafar Ali Khan is invited to an event at the Astley Theatre, which is celebrating and commemorating the victory at Waterloo. In this incredible drama is a lady called Mary Jane Flood, who's singing the ode to the fallen martyrs of Waterloo. And the lady's name is Mary Jane Flood. Almost instantly, Mir Jafar Ali Khan falls in love with her. Yes, he's a married man, but it's been an arranged marriage. Yes, he's a married man, but he's been married only a few months to the daughter of the Qazi of Ahmedabad. Yes, he's a married man, but it was a marriage of convenience, to be fair. And here he's in England, and he falls in love with Mary Jane Flood, who's an orphan. She lost her parents at a very young age. She was in London trying to make a mark for herself. She was a poor lady from a small town called Burnley, but strikingly beautiful. And Mir Jafar Ali Khan is taken in by the fact that she's a self-made woman. He's not used to self-made women. You know, here is a lady who's gone through so much in life, and she's out there carving her destiny. So while his papers are being studied by the special committee, the Indian prince has fallen in love. Anyways, the good news after 6 months of study is that the Judicial Committee rules that the Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill can be placed in the House of Commons. This is the first time that a bill to win back the rights of an Indian prince would be placed in the House of Commons for debate. It would not be easy, but it would be placed for debate. Now, it's also vital to understand here that the English East India Company is so powerful that they have their own members of parliament who are also shareholders in the company. Leading luminaries in Britain are members of parliament who have stakeholdership in the East India Company. You know, the Duke of Argyll, for example, stakeholder in the company as well as a member of parliament. Sir Robert Vernon Smith, President of the East India Company, Member of Parliament. Sir James Weir Hogg, Director of the East India Company, Member of Parliament. So the East India Company is mighty powerful even in the House of Commons. But Mir Jafar Ali Khan is resolute along with his lawyers, and the bill is tabled. The bill is tabled in 1856, and as soon as the bill gets tabled, the MPs that are loyal to the East India Company sabotage the bill. They do not let the bill go for its hearing. They do not let the bill get spoken about. Sir Fitzroy Kelly stands up to speak, but he is subdued. There's so much pressure on the speaker that the bill is not heard. Then again, on the second hearing, while it is scheduled, the second hearing does not take place because there's immense pressure on the speaker for the bill not to be passed. Not to be heard. Forget about being passed. The speaker, and I would like you, wonderful viewers, students, all of you, to picture this. Here is an Indian prince sitting in the House of Commons, the first time, fighting the East India Company, who are representatives of empire in their own bastion of law and justice, which is the House of Commons. And as each session goes by and he's realizing that the speaker is not going to let the bill be heard, you can imagine the immense pressure, anticipation, despair that he's feeling. So finally, on June 28th, apologies for that, the speaker gives consent for the bill to be spoken about. It's a raging debate that happens. The MPs from the East India Company are scathing of of India. They are scathing of the rulers of India. They call the rulers of India nincompoops. They try and say how brilliant the East India Company is in bringing order to India. They try and talk about how brilliant the East India Company is in managing Surat, which is complete contradictory to what the actual affairs are. But the three lawyers on behalf of Meer Jafar Ali Khan, that is Sir Richard Bethel, who is the Solicitor General to the Queen, Sir Fitzroy Kelly, and Sir Erskine Perry are resolute. And they fight fire with fire. And it's a heated debate where Sir Fitzroy Kelly and Sir Richard Bethel prove on the House of Commons the treacherousness of the East India Company. And if you would give me permission, I might read out a passage from the book. Is that all right? Can I read a little passage from the book about the intense battle in the Houses of Parliament? Please just say it's okay, and then I can read a bit from that. It won't be much, but just a quick passage. Is that okay? Okay, so great. So I'll just read a little passage out. Just bear with me a second. Okay, great. So I'll read a quick passage out for you folks. So two MPs that are loyal to the British East India Company start contradicting each other, and just see the drama. The two MPs that are loyal to the East India Company start contradicting each other. One of the MPs says, "Oh, we're doing a great job in India." The other MP says, "Oh no, we're not doing a great job in India." So I'll read this. Then looking at Meer Jafar Ali Khan, Smith again offered something unexpected. Panicking, he said, "Let's meet outside Parliament and strike a deal." Not only was the company in complete disarray, sorry about that, and totally divided in opinion, they were now desperately, under Smith, the president of the board, looking for a way to get out of Parliament. The ground was fast shifting under the company's feet. Smith was almost pleading with Meer Jafar Ali Khan for an outside settlement. 14 years of struggle came alive in Meer Jafar Ali Khan's mind. He thought of how, as a 17-year-old, his destiny found its way as the custodian of the House of Surat. For years, the East India Company had hounded him in Hindustan. For years, they had blocked every road for justice for him. They had brought him, his girls, his daughters, to the brink of ruin. They had robbed him and his girls of their birthright. Now, in their own parliament, now in Britain, now in England, the East India Company stood defeated, almost on the ropes, looking desperately towards him for a settlement outside. Finally, the East India Company is pushed to the brink, and the Speaker gives the consent to vote. Minute after minute, the MPs are looking at the clock, because if the vote doesn't happen, the bill will be defeated. Finally, once the Speaker has ascended with his hand for the vote to be given, the result is an astonishing result. Out of 241 votes, the final count is 213 ayes in favor of an Indian and 28 noes. This is the first time in British Indian history that the English East India Company was defeated in their own House of Commons by an Indian, when 213 MPs, British MPs, were compelled to vote in favor of an Indian against 28 noes. The Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill 1856 passed through a thumping majority. The income was restored to Meer Jafar Ali Khan and his daughters. The private estates were restored to the family. And within 1 year, India broke out into open rebellion, what we call the Great Uprising of 1857, and by 1858, the English East India Company was terminated. So this is the story of Surat, fall of a port, rise of a prince. But what happens to Mir Jafar Ali Khan and his English girlfriend? Does he take her back to India? Does he lead a life under the warm Indian sun with his English girlfriend? What happens to his wife? Does he have a son? Who is the son? What happens to Kamadhya, the rural principality in Kathiawar? Well, I'll give you a little glimpse. Mir Jafar Ali Khan does keep his promise to the orphan lady Mary Jane Flood, and he does take her back to India. He tries to marry her, but the English East India Company do not give permission to an Indian to marry the English lady. He does have a son, but he does not have a son from Mary Jane Flood. He has a son from his wife, the daughter of the Qazi of Ahmedabad. What happens to Kamadhya, his paternal principality? Well, he takes Mary Jane Flood to Kamadhya, and he spends some incredible years in Kamadhya, in the rural principality in Saurashtra, with Mary Jane Flood, the English actress. But what happens to Mir Jafar Ali Khan? Unfortunately, Mir Jafar Ali Khan is poisoned at the very young age of 46, and he dies in the arms of Mary Jane Flood, bleeding profusely. His grave became a revered, for people who don't know what a dargah is a shrine. His grave became a shrine in Surat, and it continues to be there. It's a simple shrine, but if you would like to know more, do read my book, Surat, Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. It's published by Rowley, and I hope you would enjoy it. So that's that. I'm happy to take any questions. I hope I haven't exceeded my time limit, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. If only Indians had continued to use the British Empire's own system to defeat, like the Nawab of Surat did, Khalida Khan. Absolutely, Khalida Khan. The system wasn't easy to use. You had to be resolute. You had to fight. You had to have the means as well, and most importantly, you had to be someone who, excuse me, who had to be resolute enough to take them on. Who poisoned him? Ronita, thank you for the question. I'm not going to tell you that. Please do buy the book and read it. There should be some mystery behind it, right? Janaba Rana Safi Sahiba, what happened to his son? Janaba Rana Safi Sahiba, thank you so much for the question. His son Mir Zulfiqar Ali Khan went on to rule his paternal principality Kamadhya. He was also sent for further education to Britain, and as a young man, and he came to Britain as a young man. He looked after Mary Jane Flood as his own mother would, but if you would read the book again, you'd discover many more delightful anecdotes in it. Didn't catch the title of the book. The title of the book is Surat, Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. What happened to the estate post 1857? Kamadhya as an estate is still very much there. The Darbargarh, as we know it, it fell to ruin. But my wife Leonie and I are trying to restore it slowly, hopefully once we restore it, we plan to dedicate it to the memory of Mir Jafar Ali Khan and Mary Jane Flood. Did Surat participate in the revolt of 1857? No, Surat did not participate in the revolt of 1857 because the Prince of Surat was fighting the British in the Houses of Parliament. So in many ways you can say that the Prince of Surat was part of the revolt, but a year ahead. He was fighting them in 1856, not in 1857. Zarra Nawazi, Janaba Rana Safi Sahiba, Zarra Nawazi, Shukriya. Thank you. It will be delightful to hear from you once you read the book, your thoughts and comments. If there are any more questions, is the book available on Libdim? Kindle. On Kindle. Well, the book is available on Kindle, so do honor that. Do buy that. Would your title be Nawab of Kamadia? That's a very interesting question. The Nawab of Surat as a title does not exist. The Nawab of Surat is very similar. The case of the Nawab of Surat is very similar to the Nawab of Awadh. There is no Nawab of Awadh. There is no Nawab of Surat. They are descendants of the Nawab of Surat. I am one of the descendants of the Nawab of Surat. But titles are basically abolished in India, so there's no title of Nawab of Kamadia. If the titles were there, it would have been Darbar Nawab of Kamadia, because the titles in Saurashtra were Darbars. So the title would have been Darbar Nawab Sahib of Kamadia. What happened to Surat after the judgment? Did Meer Jafar... Yes, Mir Jafar Ali did get back, as I mentioned, and he did win back the estates. Today on those estates you have shopping malls, which the family still gets rent from. They aren't, magnificent gardens and magnificent estates as you would imagine them to be in Britain. But yes, they do exist in that form. Would you say his revolt in the British court kind of kicked off the 1857 revolution? Wonderful question. I wouldn't say that he was the reason for the revolution being kicked off. He was part of it. There was enough turbulence already in India. The high-handedness in which the East India Company handled Jhansi, the high-handedness in which they handled Awadh, the high-handedness in which they annexed Satara. All of these contributed towards the 1857 revolution. Mir Jafar Ali Khan's case was just one of the many cases, but indeed it contributed towards the end of the East India Company. How long did you work on the manuscript from concept to publication? Well, it took me close to 5 years to finish the book. Do you still go to Kamadia? Oh yes, of course. My wife, she's German, and we visit Kamadia every year. We're there every year in the winter for a few days, and then we visit Surat as well. Yeah, very much so. Right, I think we've done quite well, folks. Once again, I thank you for your time and your attention. You've been very generous with your time and a wonderful audience. Once again, here's the book. It's available at all bookshops. It's available on Kindle. It's available, basically to read on all means. Thank you very much. All the very best, and please do stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.